The village of Linwood St. James prided itself on being the sort of place where nothing truly dreadful ever happened. Disagreements might flare over committee meetings, the annual flower show, or the proper way to prune hydrangeas, but life generally carried on with gentle predictability. Even the weather, so often uncooperative in other parts of England, seemed to show the village a degree of affection, offering mild breezes and soft sunshine on most afternoons. Thus, on the day of Mrs. Penelope Hartwell's famed summer garden party, the villagers arrived in particularly jovial spirits. The Hartwell estate, sprawling, ivy-covered, and lovingly tended, offered the perfect backdrop for the season's first major social event. Tables draped in crisp white cloths lined the lawn, laden with tiered trays of cucumber sandwiches, soft scones dusted with sugar, and crystal bowls of strawberries gleaming like rubies beneath the sun. Miss Jane Marple arrived slightly later than usual, though not so late as to cause comment. She moved through the garden with her habitual soft step, nodding politely to acquaintances and offering warm smiles to those who sought her company. To most, she appeared to be nothing more than an elderly gentlewoman, frail of frame and fond of knitting. Yet those who truly knew her understood that Miss Marple noticed everything. Every raised eyebrow, every strained smile, every small, telling inconsistency in human behavior. She settled herself beneath a striped canopy, where she could comfortably observe the gathering without appearing intrusive. From her vantage point, she saw Mrs. Hartwell bustling about like a well-dressed whirlwind, greeting guests with too bright enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting all winter for this very moment. Beside the refreshment table stood Mr. Edwin Finch, a quiet bachelor of 60-odd years who had built a reputation in Linwood as a man of routine and modesty. He taught piano to the village children, tended a surprisingly successful rose garden, and was seldom seen without the black umbrella he considered his dependable companion. It was this umbrella, or rather its sudden absence, that triggered the afternoon's first ripple of disturbance. Miss Marple noticed it before anyone else. Mr. Finch approached Mrs. Hartwell with an expression of mild distress, bowing his head slightly as he spoke. Though the conversation was polite, the tension in his shoulders suggested genuine anxiety. Mrs. Hartwell waved her hands dramatically, looking around as though something terribly precious had gone missing. Within minutes, the matter became a subject of general curiosity. The umbrella, plain, dark, and unremarkable except for its silver-tipped handle, had been left near the veranda along with the other guests' coats and walking sticks. Now it had vanished. "Well, I never," exclaimed Miss Maud Hennessy, a robust woman with a talent for melodrama. "Who on earth would steal an umbrella, especially Mr. Finch's? He guards that thing more carefully than some people guard diamonds." A few guests laughed, but Mr. Finch did not. His kind grey eyes looked troubled, and he paced the edge of the lawn, scanning the hedges as if expecting the umbrella to leap out from behind them. Miss Marple quietly folded her hands, her gaze soft yet perceptive. In her experience, small disturbances often led to larger truths. A lost umbrella might seem trivial, but the agitation it caused was undeniably real. And agitation, particularly in a quiet village, had a way of revealing deeper undercurrents. Conversations shifted. The missing umbrella became a topic of lively speculation. "Probably taken by mistake," insisted Mr. George Ainsworth, the village solicitor, who liked to offer practical solutions to every problem. "Umbrellas look terribly similar these days." "Not Mr. Finch's," chimed in Mrs. Hennessy again. "His has that lovely silver tip. I've admired it for years." "That I know," murmured Miss Marple to herself. She had noticed the tip as well. Engraved, if she recalled correctly, though she hadn't yet had occasion to inspect it close enough to make out the lettering. While the guests debated, the atmosphere subtly shifted. A sense of unease, thin as mist, drifted through the gathering. It was not simply the umbrella's disappearance. People lost things all the time, but the feeling that something about this particular absence was intentional. Mr. Finch finally stopped pacing and stood near the rose arbor, looking more vulnerable than Miss Marple had ever seen him. He seemed less concerned about the umbrella itself and more about why it had gone missing. And then came the cry, sharp, startled, and immediately silencing all conversation. A maid had discovered something behind the clipped yew bushes bordering the garden. Miss Marple rose slowly, leaning lightly on her walking stick, her eyes narrowing with concern. She did not hurry. There was no need. Whatever had been found was still waiting, and the truth, as always, would reveal itself in due course. But as she approached the growing crowd, she sensed quite clearly that this was no longer simply a matter of a lost umbrella. Something far darker had unfolded in the Hartwell garden. Miss Marple approached the yew bushes with the quiet steadiness of someone who had seen far more commotion in her lifetime than most people ever imagined. The guests, clustered like startled sparrows, parted instinctively to let her through. The maid who had screamed, young Alice Brewer, cheeks flushed and apron askew, stood pointing a trembling hand toward the narrow gap between the hedges. "There, ma'am. Behind the branches," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, peering through the foliage without yet disturbing it. A small, leather-bound notebook lay half buried in the grass, its cover scuffed and its pages slightly fanned by the breeze. For a moment, she said nothing. She merely observed. The notebook was old, well used, in fact, and the initials stamped in faded gold on the corner confirmed what she already suspected. E.F. Edwin Finch. Mr. Finch stepped forward as though pulled by an invisible string. "My notebook!" he exclaimed softly, though the relief in his voice was overshadowed by a faint dread. He reached out a hand to retrieve it, but Miss Marple gently motioned for him to wait. "Perhaps," she said kindly, "it might be best to leave it where it is for just a moment. One never knows if something fell or was placed." Her tone was mild, almost conversational, yet her words sent a ripple of tension through the gathered crowd. Mr. Finch hesitated, then nodded stiffly. He looked oddly fragile, as if the quiet drama unfolding around him threatened to unravel something deep within. Mrs. Hartwell fluttered forward, her voice rising with anxious hospitality. "Surely it's nothing more than someone knocking it off the table. These things do happen in a gathering this large." But Miss Marple knew better. She studied the notebook's position, tucked so neatly beneath the hedge that it could not have fallen there by chance. Someone had put it there, hidden it. Miss Marple had spent a lifetime observing small human gestures, the subtle ways guilt or fear expressed itself. A misplaced notebook and a missing umbrella. It was far too much coincidence for an afternoon tea. The maid, still pale, managed to stammer, "I thought it was something else. With all the talk of the umbrella gone missing, I didn't expect—" She trailed off, embarrassed, but Miss Marple gave her a reassuring nod. "You were quite right to call attention to it. Little things are often more important than they seem." Mr. George Ainsworth pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose. "But what does it signify? A misplaced notebook hardly warrants alarm." Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Maud Hennessy standing behind him, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. A woman like Mrs. Hennessy loved a scandal more than a scone, yet even she seemed more contemplative than dramatic this time. "It signifies," Miss Marple replied gently, "that Mr. Finch's belongings are turning up in rather unexpected places." Mr. Finch swallowed hard. "Miss Marple, I must admit, that notebook contains personal matters, lessons, schedules, and, private reflections. I never lose it." The emphasis on never hung in the air like dust motes in sunlight. Miss Marple bent slightly and, using a handkerchief, retrieved the notebook with great care. She did not open it. It was not her place to pry, but she turned it over slowly, noting several fresh scratches across the cover. Marks from rough handling, or perhaps nails brushing it in haste. A faint smear of soil stained the lower corner, as if it had been dropped or pushed into the hedge with deliberate intent. Mrs. Hartwell's voice trembled as she asked, "But whatever for? Who could want to hide Mr. Finch's notebook?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, She looked thoughtfully toward the veranda, where the guests' coats and umbrellas had been neatly arranged. Or rather, had once been arranged. Somewhere among that tidy row had stood Mr. Finch's umbrella, with its silver-tipped handle, quite distinctive, quite memorable. "It is possible," she said softly, "that the person who hid this notebook also knows what happened to the umbrella." A collective shiver passed through the group. Two belongings missing, one reappearing, one not. The pattern was forming, faint but unmistakable. Mr. Finch's face grew paler, and his hand trembled as he accepted the notebook from Miss Marple. "Thank you," he whispered. "Who would do this to me? I can't imagine anyone here harboring ill will." But Miss Marple, whose gentle blue eyes missed very little, noted several glances exchanged among the guests, quick, nervous, fleeting. Glances that betrayed tension, discomfort, and perhaps guilt. "People often conceal more than one might guess," she replied kindly, "even in a peaceful village." Before anyone could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the branches overhead, scattering flower petals across the grass like confetti. The party, once cheerful and bright, now felt heavy with uncertainty. Laughter had ceased entirely. Conversations hovered at the edge of whispers. The afternoon's earlier warmth had shifted into something taut and foreboding. Miss Marple walked back toward her chair. Though she did not sit, she simply stood, surveying the garden with calm attentiveness. The pieces were shifting, slowly, subtly, inevitably. Somewhere among the guests, someone knew exactly why Mr. Finch's umbrella had vanished, and someone knew why his notebook had been hidden. Miss Marple understood well that such disturbances rarely unfolded without purpose, and though nothing more alarming than a missing umbrella and a misplaced notebook had yet surfaced, she could not escape the unmistakable sense that something far more troubling lay beneath the surface. She felt it in the uneasy air, in the strained voices, in the way certain guests avoided each other's eyes. A storm was coming to Linwood St. James, and it had only just begun. The garden grew quieter as Miss Marple returned to her chair, her eyes never leaving the shifting expressions of the guests. Mr. Finch clutched his notebook tightly, as though it were a talisman against some unseen threat. Even in the midst of polite society, one could not disguise discomfort entirely, and several villagers, despite their attempts at casual conversation, had begun to exhibit subtle signs of tension. Fingers fidgeted with gloves, lips pressed together in thought, eyes darting briefly to neighbors before flicking away. Miss Marple took note of each small motion with meticulous attention, as one might observe the drift of clouds that hinted at an impending storm. Miss Hartwell, attempting to restore the earlier gaiety, clapped her hands softly and said, "Well, now that the notebook is recovered, perhaps we might continue with the tea and sandwiches. Surely a missing umbrella cannot spoil such a delightful afternoon." Her words rang faintly hollow, and even she seemed aware of the fragility of the moment. A few guests smiled politely and returned to their tea, but the undercurrent of unease persisted. Miss Marple noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that the tension seemed concentrated around two particular individuals. Mr. George Ainsworth, ever the practical observer, had resumed his polite chatter, though his voice carried a hint of impatience. And Mrs. Maud Hennessy, whose dramatics usually colored every gathering, appeared unusually measured, almost calculating, as she observed the other guests through narrowed eyes. It was Mr. Finch who finally broke the fragile silence. "I must confess," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that belied his polite demeanor, "that I am puzzled. I cannot imagine who would take or misplace my umbrella in such a manner. It has been in my care for years, and never once has it been absent when needed." His gaze swept the garden, lingering just long enough on a few faces to provoke mild discomfort. Miss Marple, observing him closely, noted the subtle tremor in his hands and the slight quiver in his lips. He was genuinely perturbed, but more than perturbed. There was a thread of apprehension in his expression that suggested he suspected something more than mere misplacement. And if Mr. Finch suspected, then surely someone else had reason to act as well. Small-town life often fostered minor resentments that could grow over time, hidden beneath a veneer of civility until some trifling event provoked them. The disappearance of an umbrella, seemingly trivial, might have been the spark that ignited a far more insidious tension. Miss Marple sipped her tea deliberately, allowing the steam to rise and obscure her eyes momentarily. In her experience, time often clarified matters better than immediate inquiry. And while the village might chatter and speculate, real insight came from observing patterns of behavior and the subtle inconsistencies in what people said versus what they did. Already she had noticed a pattern forming, small, almost imperceptible, but significant. There was a nervousness among some of the guests, a careful avoidance of certain glances, and the way hands fidgeted with gloves or napkins. Her attention returned to Mr. Finch. He was now walking slowly along the edge of the lawn, his gaze drifting toward the veranda, as if measuring every detail in the hopes of spotting the lost umbrella. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The umbrella was not merely missing, it had vanished in a context, a moment that suggested intention. Intentionality, after all, was the hallmark of human design. Accidents did not carry the same weight in behavior. Whoever had taken it, or hidden it, had done so with purpose. And purpose, in turn, implied motive. Across the lawn, a sudden stir caught her attention. Alice Brewer, the maid, had dropped a tray of pastries in her nervous haste, and the clatter drew several heads. Miss Marple noted the faint blush that crept up her neck, the quick downward glance, and the way she immediately tried to gather the pastries without drawing attention to herself. It was a minor incident, yet in the intricate web of human observation, small disturbances were often the key to understanding greater ones. "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, more to herself than anyone else, "the smallest detail will reveal the greatest truth." She watched as Mrs. Hennessy leaned closer to Mrs. Hartwell, whispering with an intensity that suggested the sharing of a secret too delicate for general hearing. And though no one else noticed, the corners of Mr. Ainsworth's mouth twitched almost imperceptibly, a hint of suppressed irritation or perhaps concern. The afternoon pressed on with polite conversation and carefully measured smiles. But beneath the veneer, the tension remained palpable. Miss Marple, ever patient, allowed the gathering to continue, her mind quietly arranging the observations she had made. Each glance, each tremor of a hand, each avoidance of eye contact was catalogued and stored for future consideration. The pattern was emerging, though no one else yet recognized it. And somewhere, just beyond the polite garden chatter and the soft clinking of teacups, the true significance of the lost umbrella and the hidden notebook waited to reveal itself. As the afternoon wore on, the uneasy calm in the Hartwell garden began to thicken. Guests spoke in clipped sentences, their words polite but lacking the easy rhythm of genuine conversation. Even the children, who had been playing quietly among the rose bushes, seemed aware of the tension, their laughter subdued, their games hesitant. Miss Marple observed them from beneath her parasol, noting with quiet satisfaction the way subtle shifts in behavior often revealed truths adults overlooked. Mr. Finch had returned to the veranda, his notebook clasped firmly to his chest, and stood staring at the line of umbrellas and walking sticks, now intact save for his own. He ran a hand over his silver-tipped umbrella, which had somehow reappeared near a chair where no one recalled seeing it before. The reunion did little to restore his composure. Instead, it highlighted his earlier distress. The umbrella's disappearance, and its equally sudden return, was clearly orchestrated, and the thought unsettled him. Mrs. Hartwell, desperate to regain some semblance of cheer, suggested a stroll through her garden's lesser-known paths. "It's such a fine day," she said, a hint of pleading in her voice. "A walk might do us all good, don't you think?" Most guests hesitated, still mindful of the invisible tension, but a few nodded politely and followed her. Miss Marple, as always, moved at her own pace, lingering near the veranda to observe rather than participate. It was then that she noticed something peculiar. Across the garden, near the fountain, Mrs. Maud Hennessy appeared to be examining a small patch of disturbed earth. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Miss Marple's keen eye detected a faint flush of embarrassment, coupled with a slight quickening of her breathing. The woman had no reason to linger there, and her attention seemed unusually focused on the ground itself rather than the surrounding flora. Curious, Miss Marple walked toward the fountain, her gaze casually sweeping the area as though inspecting the flowers rather than the soil. The disturbed earth was slight, almost imperceptible to anyone less observant, yet the pattern was unmistakable. A small indentation had been pressed into the soft dirt, as if something small and valuable had been placed there or retrieved hastily. Miss Marple's mind, working in its usual, quiet rhythm, catalogued the observation. Small, deliberate movements such as this often accompanied attempts to hide or recover items of significance. Meanwhile, Mr. George Ainsworth approached Mr. Finch, speaking in tones meant to reassure, though they betrayed a trace of impatience. "I dare say this is all a simple misunderstanding," he said. "Perhaps someone absent-mindedly borrowed your umbrella or notebook. No need for alarm." Mr. Finch shook his head, eyes troubled. "I fear it is not so simple. Items do not vanish in Linwood, St. James, without reason. Something deliberate has occurred." Miss Marple, still standing near the fountain, watched both men carefully. Their gestures, their posture, the inflection in their voices, all suggested varying levels of discomfort. One might have expected anxiety from Mr. Finch, but Ainsworth's polite insistence carried an undercurrent of something else, mild exasperation perhaps, or concern that the disturbance might expose matters better left undisturbed. The garden remained deceptively serene. Sunlight dappled through the leaves, and the roses released a gentle fragrance that seemed at odds with the unease threaded through the gathering. Miss Marple's attention, however, had shifted subtly from the objects themselves to the people surrounding them. Behavior, after all, often revealed more than the objects of interest ever could, and she had already begun to sense which glances, which gestures, and which hesitations mattered most. As she observed, a new movement caught her eye. Alice Brewer, the maid, was quietly gathering fallen petals from near the fountain, her movements careful, almost self-conscious. She appeared to glance frequently toward Mrs. Hennessy, as if awaiting instruction or gauging reaction. Miss Marple noted the subtle hierarchy in their interactions, the quiet deference, the tension lingering in their proximity. It suggested knowledge of something unsaid, something small yet potentially significant. Miss Marple leaned lightly on her walking stick, eyes tracing the interplay of gestures across the lawn. There was a rhythm to the unease, a pattern that promised revelation if one were patient enough to wait and watch. Already, the afternoon's simple disruptions, the lost umbrella, the hidden notebook, the disturbed earth, were beginning to connect in ways subtle enough to escape casual observation, yet unmistakable to someone who had spent a lifetime understanding human nature. And so she waited, calmly, allowing the village's hidden currents to reveal themselves in the ordinary actions of its residents. Each seemingly minor gesture a clue in the quiet unfolding of a much larger truth. The unease in the Hartwell garden had not lessened as the afternoon continued. If anything, it had thickened, like the approaching shadows that now stretched longer across the neatly trimmed lawns. Miss Marple remained seated, her posture unassuming, yet her gaze moved with the patience and precision of someone accustomed to noticing what others overlooked. The missing umbrella and the hidden notebook were, of course, the obvious disturbances, but it was the subtle ripples in behavior, the sideways glances, the hesitant gestures, the half-formed smiles that spoke volumes. Mr. Finch, still holding his notebook, had begun to pace again, albeit slowly, as though seeking reassurance in movement. "I simply cannot fathom who would interfere in such a way," he murmured to Mr. Ainsworth, who nodded politely, though his eyes were alert, scanning the surrounding guests with a faint trace of unease. Miss Marple's attention shifted slightly toward him. There was a controlled tension in Ainsworth's expression, a careful monitoring of reactions that hinted at involvement or, at the very least, knowledge of something significant. Near the fountain, Mrs. Maud Hennessy appeared to study the roses with a curious intensity. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the stone basin, but her eyes were not on the flowers. They flicked continuously toward Mr. Bull, Finch, and then back toward the house, as if anticipating someone or something. Miss Marple's quiet mind catalogued the observation. In Linwood, St. James, where appearances were everything, such small inconsistencies were rarely accidental. People rarely behaved in ways that conflicted with their usual social masks, unless prompted by fear, guilt, or expectation. Alice Brewer, still fidgeting with her apron, moved cautiously among the guests, picking up crumbs and straightening misplaced napkins. She glanced repeatedly toward Mrs. Hennessy, betraying a nervous awareness of the older woman's attention. Miss Marple, noting the interplay, considered how the dynamics between maid and guest might conceal more than simple social hierarchy. Often a servant's observations were more candid than those of the social circle she served. At last, Mr. Finch stopped pacing and drew a deep breath. "I fear I must insist we consider that these incidents are not coincidental," he said, his voice firmer now, though a faint tremor betrayed his continued anxiety. "An umbrella vanishes, a notebook is hidden, and now—" His eyes flicked toward the disturbed soil near the fountain, where Miss Marple had noticed Mrs. Hennessy's earlier inspection. "I cannot imagine any of this happening without intent." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the point without revealing the conclusions forming quietly in her mind. Intent was often the invisible thread linking seemingly trivial actions, and when combined with motive, it had a way of exposing the most well-hidden secrets. She sipped her tea and watched, allowing the guests to reveal themselves through the natural language of human behavior. A sudden movement drew her attention. Mrs. Hennessy stepped back from the fountain as if startled by her own proximity to the disturbed earth. She brushed imaginary dust from her gloves, though the gesture appeared more performative than necessary. Miss Marple noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the quickness with which she glanced at Mr. Finch and then around the garden. There was a fleeting recognition in her expression, a whisper of awareness that something important had been observed by someone else. Mr. Ainsworth, meanwhile, had moved to stand near Mrs. Hartwell, speaking quietly in tones that were careful and measured. He gestured toward the umbrellas, the notebook, and even the disturbed soil, as though attempting to rationalize the incidents for everyone's benefit. Yet his voice, though calm, carried an edge that suggested impatience, perhaps even worry that scrutiny might lead to uncomfortable truths. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the garden, and Miss Marple's eyes followed the interplay of movement, posture, and glance. Every minor act, the fidgeted glove, the hesitated step, the subtle glance exchanged, was a thread, and she was beginning to see how those threads might weave together. Someone had deliberately caused the disturbances. And if disturbances could be orchestrated with such care and subtlety, then the person responsible had both motive and awareness of the delicate social fabric they were manipulating. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and allowed a faint, knowing smile to touch her lips. The village might chatter, speculate, and misdirect attention with gossip and polite concern, but the truth, she reflected, often revealed itself in quiet observation, and she intended to see it unfold fully, with patience, precision, and a calmness that concealed the sharpness of her insight. By mid-afternoon, the garden's earlier cheerfulness had faded entirely, replaced by an uneasy hush that seemed to hover over the guests like a thin, invisible veil. Conversations, when they occurred, were guarded and clipped. Even the laughter of children playing near the rose arbor was restrained, tentative, as if they too sensed shift in atmosphere. Miss Marple, seated beneath the striped canopy, sipped her tea with unhurried composure, her mind quietly cataloguing every nuance, every fee, every flicker of expression, every tremor in posture that might indicate hidden tensions. Mr. Finch, still gripping his notebook, had begun to examine the fountain area more closely. His movements were careful, deliberate, almost as if he expected the missing umbrella or some other concealed item to reappear at any moment. "It is curious," he murmured to no one in particular, though his eyes flicked toward Mrs. Hennessy, who stood a few paces away, adjusting her gloves with meticulous attention. Nothing in Linwood St. James is ever truly lost, yet today, these objects vanish without explanation, Mrs. Hennessy's gaze briefly met his, though she quickly looked away, pretending interest in the roses. Miss Marple noticed the subtle tension in her fingers, the slight tightening of her jaw, and the brief flicker of apprehension in her eyes. It was these small inconsistencies, the gestures people made when they tried to maintain composure, that often spoke louder than words. Nearby, Mr. George Ainsworth had stationed himself with a polite, careful attentiveness near Mrs. Hartwell. He spoke softly, rationalizing the incidents as simple mistakes, minor misunderstanding. Yet the faint quiver in his voice betrayed him. His polite assurances seemed directed as much to himself as to anyone else. Miss Marple observed the way he cast glances toward Mr. Finch, then to Mrs. Hennessy, as if measuring the reactions of others while maintaining an appearance of casual involvement. Alice Brewer, the young maid, moved quietly between the adults, straightening chairs and picking up stray napkins. Miss Marple's eyes followed her attentively. The girl's small, hesitant glances at Mrs. Hennessy suggested an unspoken connection, a hint that she had noticed, or perhaps even witnessed, something significant. Servants often saw things their employers overlooked, and Miss Marple had long recognized that such observations could be vital. Suddenly, a soft clatter sounded near the veranda. A dropped silver spoon, perhaps, or a mismanaged sugar tongs, but the effect was immediate. Heads turned, voices faltered, and for a brief moment, the guests' carefully maintained composure fractured. Mr. Finch's hand tightened around the notebook. Mrs. Hartwell gasped softly, her nervous energy now overt, and Mrs. Hennessy's posture stiffened as she straightened, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her skirt. The small disruption, insignificant in itself, had served to reveal the undercurrents of tension in a most telling manner. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. It was often the minor, seemingly trivial incidents, the clatter of a spoon, a dropped napkin, a shifted chair, that precipitated the first honest reactions from otherwise composed individuals. And in those reactions, patterns emerged. Subtle guilt, concealed anxiety, and even faint flashes of recognition were all laid bare for those who knew how to watch. Mr. Finch's voice broke the silence, measured yet tremulous. "I cannot help but wonder," he said, "if the disappearance of my umbrella and the hiding of my notebook are connected in some way. It is improbable, indeed impossible, that these occurrences are mere accidents." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his observation without giving any hint of her own conclusions. She had long since noted the connections he himself had not yet articulated. The subtle disturbances, the quiet gestures, the fleeting glances that betrayed more than words ever could. The patterns were becoming discernible, though the majority of the villagers remained blissfully unaware. Across the garden, Mrs. Hennessy and Alice Brewer exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. Miss Marple caught it immediately. There was recognition there, shared knowledge that neither wished to voice aloud. She filed the detail carefully, alongside the other observations, knowing that, in time, every small clue would coalesce into a complete picture. The afternoon pressed on, the sunlight growing warmer, yet beneath the garden's beauty and the polite exterior of the guests, a quiet tension lingered. Miss Marple, with her customary patience, continued to watch and wait. She knew that it was only a matter of time before someone's small gesture, word, or glance would reveal the truth that lay just beneath the surface of the village's social calm. And when that moment arrived, she would be ready to see it with the clarity and insight she had honed over a lifetime. The garden seemed to hold its breath as the late afternoon sun slanted through the rose bushes, casting elongated shadows that crept across the carefully trimmed lawn. Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded over her parasol, watching with quiet attention. The earlier incidents, the vanishing umbrella, the hidden notebook, the small disturbances among the guests, had unsettled the village in ways that were both subtle and profound. Yet, it was the way people responded afterward, the minute gestures and unguarded expressions that offered the truest insight into their character. Mr. Finch, now calmer, held his notebook against his chest and walked slowly along the veranda, glancing repeatedly toward the line of umbrellas. His silver-tipped companion had returned to its proper place, yet his brow remained furrowed. "There is more to this," he murmured, as though speaking to the garden itself. "I cannot shake the feeling that these events were not accidental, nor entirely random." Miss Marple noted the glance he cast toward Mrs. Maud Hennessy. The subtle way his eyes lingered, combined with the faint stiffness in his posture, suggested a mind searching for explanations, yet aware of being subtly observed in return. Mrs. Hennessy, for her part, maintained a carefully composed facade, but Miss Marple's keen eye caught the fleeting tightness in her lips and the almost imperceptible shift of her shoulders. She was aware of something, yet sought to conceal it under a practiced veneer of polite attention. Across the garden, Mr. George Ainsworth had begun to speak in quiet, measured tones to Mrs. Hartwell. Miss Marple, observing, noticed how he gestured lightly toward the fountain and the rose beds, as though attempting to normalize the afternoon's peculiar incidents. Yet his voice, though calm, betrayed slight strain, an edge that suggested unease. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the gathering, a sign that he was watching not only the scene but the reactions of others. It was the behavior of someone who feared exposure or discovery, subtle but telling. Alice Brewer, the young maid, lingered nearby, adjusting a tray of teacups with exaggerated care. Miss Marple saw the way her eyes flicked between Mrs. Hennessy and Mr. Paddy. Finch, as though silently tracking the flow of the conversation and the gestures of the adults. Her small, deliberate movements betrayed heightened awareness. She was clearly conscious of something that the others preferred to ignore. Servants often had sharper perceptions than their employers, and Miss Marple made a mental note of the girl's attentiveness. Mrs. Hartwell, perhaps sensing the growing tension, tried once more to restore a cheerful atmosphere. "Let us have some music, shall we?" she suggested brightly, nodding toward the piano near the veranda. A few guests applauded lightly, and Mr. Finch, though hesitant, moved toward the instrument. The soft notes of a familiar tune began to fill the air. Yet even the music could not entirely dispel the current of unease that ran through the gathering. Miss Marple's gaze shifted repeatedly between the guests. Patterns were emerging. Glances exchanged too quickly. Gestures that betrayed hesitation, moments of silence pregnant with unspoken thought. The incidents with the umbrella and the notebook had stirred more than curiosity. They had exposed a network of small anxieties, subtle rivalries, and hidden knowledge that the polite veneer of the village could no longer fully contain. She noted, in particular, a small incident at the far edge of the garden. A silver teaspoon had slipped from a tray and fallen to the ground, eliciting a startled movement from Mrs. Hennessy. She bent to retrieve it with exaggerated care, yet her eyes darted briefly toward Mr. Finch before settling elsewhere. Such minor reactions were the very clues Miss Marple sought. Guilt, unease, or recognition often revealed itself in gestures too small to be noticed by most, but too telling to escape someone who observed closely. The sun began to dip lower, bathing the garden in warm amber light, and shadows stretched further across the lawn. The polite gathering, once so composed, had been transformed into a landscape of subtle tensions and unspoken questions. Miss Marple, with her customary patience, remained poised to observe the next movements, the next gestures, and the next exchanges. She understood, as she always did, that in Linwood, St. James, the smallest details often concealed the deepest truths. And in the quiet, measured cadence of the garden, she knew the next revelation was approaching, though no one yet suspected how close it already was. As the late afternoon sun slanted lower across the Hartwell garden, a hush settled over the remaining guests. Conversations had dwindled to polite murmurs, each word carefully chosen, as if anyone might accidentally reveal more than intended. Miss Marple, seated beneath the striped canopy, sipped her tea with quiet composure, though her eyes roved the garden with practiced attentiveness. She observed the interplay of glances, the minute adjustments of posture, the occasional half-step backward or sideways. Subtle cues that suggested unease far deeper than the loss of a mere umbrella or a mislaid notebook. Mr. Finch, still holding his leather-bound companion close, lingered near the veranda. The silver-tipped umbrella rested at his side, its return doing little to calm his anxiety. "I cannot help but feel," he said, voice low, "that someone has been observing me, waiting for a moment to test my composure." His glance swept over the group, lingering briefly on Mrs. Hennessy, whose expression remained carefully neutral, though Miss Marple detected the brief quiver of a smile that did not reach her eyes. Across the lawn, Mr. George Ainsworth appeared to weigh his words carefully as he spoke to Mrs. Hartwell. His hand gestured lightly toward the fountain and the line of umbrellas. And though his tone suggested calm rationality, Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in his fingers, the slight stiffness of his shoulders. It was as if he were attempting to assert control over a situation that had already begun to slip from the polite order of the gathering. Alice Brewer, the maid, moved carefully among the guests, adjusting trays and straightening chairs with meticulous attention. Her eyes, however, did not linger on the objects she arranged. Instead, they flicked repeatedly toward Mrs. Hennessy and then to Mr. Finch, as though she was silently tracking their interactions, noting any irregularities. Miss Marple recognized the significance immediately. A servant's observations were often more candid than those of the social circle she served, and Alice's heightened awareness suggested she had witnessed something important, even if she did not fully understand it herself. The piano, previously silent, now emitted a few tentative notes, as if coaxed by Mrs. Hartwell to bring a sense of normality back to the garden. Mr. Finch, reluctant at first, played a simple melody, yet the attempt to restore calm felt strained. The music flowed lightly across the lawn, but it could not entirely mask the tension that lingered, woven subtly into every glance, every gesture, every careful movement. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Mrs. Hennessy. The older woman, though outwardly composed, exhibited signs of subtle agitation. Slight shifts of her weight, a faint tightening of her gloved fingers, a half-turn of the head, that suggested she was monitoring someone closely. These small behaviors, seemingly inconsequential to the casual observer, often spoke volumes in a village where appearances were guarded and secrets carefully concealed. A sudden noise near the fountain, a dropped spoon perhaps, or the soft shift of soil, caused a ripple of startled reactions. Mrs. Hennessy bent to retrieve it with exaggerated care, her eyes flicking involuntarily toward Mr. Finch before she straightened. Alice Brewer paused mid-step, her gaze following the older woman's movements with an intensity that betrayed her own nervousness. Miss Marple observed it all silently, mentally cataloguing each subtle gesture, each fleeting expression. The guests had unknowingly begun revealing themselves. Small acts, a tremor of the hand, a rapid glance, a stiffened posture, were drawing invisible threads through the gathering, connecting behavior with motive in ways that only the most careful observer could detect. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, aligning each incident, the missing umbrella, the hidden notebook, the disturbed soil, with the human responses they had provoked. Patterns were emerging, though the villagers themselves remained oblivious to the significance. The light waned further, casting the garden in a warmer, amber glow, shadows stretching longer across the lawn. Polite conversation had almost ceased, replaced by an expectant quiet. Miss Marple, as ever, waited patiently. The threads were in place. The reactions had begun to reveal more than anyone realized. And somewhere among them, the next revelation was preparing to surface, small and seemingly incidental, yet certain to expose truths long hidden beneath the surface of Linwood St. James. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the distant oaks, casting long, wavering shadows across the Hartwell garden. A quiet tension hung over the remaining guests, subtle but unmistakable. Miss Marple sat beneath her canopy, her posture demure, yet her sharp eyes observed every movement and expression with unwavering attention. Each fidgeted glove, each fleeting glance, and every slight pause in conversation was catalogued, for in Linwood St. James, the smallest gesture could conceal the largest secret. Mr. Finch, still clutching his notebook, wandered toward the edge of the rose beds. Though his silver-tipped umbrella rested safely at his side, His brow remained creased with concern. "It is curious," he murmured aloud, as though speaking to the garden itself, "that two minor incidents, the disappearance of my umbrella and the misplacement of this notebook, should occur on the same afternoon. I cannot help but suspect they are connected." Mrs. Hennessy, adjusting the lace cuff of her glove, glanced momentarily at Mr. Finch, her eyes revealing a flicker of something more than casual interest. Miss Marple noticed the subtle quickening of her breathing and the imperceptible tension in her shoulders. Such minute changes betrayed awareness and perhaps even complicity. They were seldom the product of innocent observation. Across the lawn, Mr. George Ainsworth engaged Mrs. Hartwell in polite conversation, speaking carefully while his eyes scanned the garden intermittently. Though he projected calm, Miss Marple detected the faint strain in his posture, the slight tightness of his jaw, a controlled vigilance that suggested he too was attuned to the unfolding irregularities. He seemed particularly attentive to Mrs. Hennessy's movements, noting them with measured precision, as if anticipating a revealing gesture. Alice Brewer, the maid, continued her quiet ministrations, adjusting chairs and collecting stray napkins. Her eyes, however, did not linger on these minor tasks. Instead, they moved constantly between Mrs. Hennessy and Mr. Finch, observing their interactions, their gestures, and the tiny shifts in expression. Miss Marple had long known that the servants of a household often noticed more than their employers. Alice's alertness was a silent testimony to truths she had yet to voice. A sudden stir near the fountain drew Miss Marple's attention. A small bird, startled by the faint clatter of a teacup, took flight, scattering petals across the grate. Miss Hennessy bent slightly, gathering them with deliberate care, but her eyes flicked involuntarily toward Mr. Finch before returning to her task. Alice paused mid-step, her gaze following the older woman's movements with an intensity that suggested silent communication. Miss Marple catalogued these interactions carefully, aware that such minute observations often revealed more than overt words ever could. The tension among the guests had begun to crystallize. Subtle gestures, the faint tightening of lips, the half-step backward, the rapid blink, were forming patterns. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting the disturbances of the day. The missing umbrella, the hidden notebook, the subtle disturbances near the fountain. Each incident was no longer isolated. Together, they hinted at a deliberate orchestration, a carefully constructed provocation. Mr. Finch finally spoke again, his voice low but firm. "I do not believe these events are accidental. Someone has sought to unsettle me, perhaps to draw attention away from something more significant." His eyes swept the garden, and for a brief moment he met Mrs. Hennessy's gaze. She looked away quickly, though Miss Marple noted the imperceptible hesitation before she did so. That hesitation, she realized, was the first tangible sign of intentional deception among the otherwise composed guests. The soft hum of the piano filled the garden once more, providing a delicate backdrop to the silent tension. The music, while pleasant, could not mask the careful observation unfolding beneath it. Miss Marple, folding her hands across her lap, allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. The next revelation, she understood, was imminent. The smallest gesture, the most fleeting glance, would soon unravel the web of subtle manipulations that had taken root that afternoon. And as the shadows deepened across the lawn, it was clear to Miss Marple that the quiet drama of Linwood St. James had only just begun. The evening shadows stretched across the Hartwell garden, softening the edges of flower beds and casting the guests in elongated, almost theatrical profiles. Miss Marple remained seated beneath the striped canopy, her parasol resting lightly across her lap, eyes flicking with calm precision from one guest to another. Every subtle gesture, every fleeting glance, every hesitant movement was catalogued with quiet patience. In a village such as Linwood St. James, where civility often masked discontent, the smallest behavior could speak louder than words. Mr. Finch, still clutching his notebook, wandered slowly along the veranda. The silver-tipped umbrella rested beside him, but his expression suggested he was preoccupied with more than the restoration of his belongings. "I cannot understand," he murmured under his breath, though his voice carried across the garden. Why these things would happen, unless there is some deeper intention behind them. His gaze swept the group, briefly meeting Mrs. Hennessy's eyes. She responded with an almost imperceptible tilt of her head before turning her attention back to a rose bush, a gesture that was, in Miss Marple's estimation, anything but casual. Nearby, Mr. George Ainsworth spoke quietly with Mrs. Hartwell, his posture composed, his voice polite, yet there was a tension beneath his measured tones. Miss Marple noticed the subtle way he shifted his weight, the occasional tightening of his jaw, the brief glances cast toward both Mr. Finch and Mrs. Hennessy. There was a vigilance there, a careful monitoring of the unfolding dynamics, suggesting he had his own stake in understanding, or perhaps controlling, the situation. Alice Brewer, the maid, moved among the guests with deliberate care, adjusting a tray of teacups and smoothing a displaced napkin. Her eyes, however, were drawn repeatedly to Mrs. Hennessy and then toward Mr. Finch, tracking interactions with a quiet intensity. Miss Marple's mind noted the unspoken communication between the young maid and the older woman. There was an awareness, a subtle exchange of recognition that suggested knowledge of events not yet discussed aloud. A sudden disturbance drew attention. A small branch, loosened by a gentle evening breeze, snapped against the edge of the fountain, startling a few of the guests. Mrs. Hennessy bent slightly, retrieving it, but her eyes flicked momentarily toward Mr. Finch, then shifted as if calculating the implications of being observed. Alice paused in her movements, eyes lingering on the older woman, before continuing her duties with a quiet deliberation. Miss Marple, watching, saw the interplay of attention and reaction, recognizing the patterns that others failed to perceive. The afternoon's earlier incidents, the missing umbrella, the hidden notebook, the disturbed soil, were no longer isolated events. Each small act, each subtle reaction, was part of a larger tapestry. Miss Marple's gaze shifted over the garden, noting the delicate choreography of gestures and expressions. There was unease, yes, but also intent. A careful orchestration of actions meant to observe, conceal, or provoke responses. Mr. Finch finally spoke again, voice steadying with determination. "I am convinced," he said, "that these occurrences are not accidental. Someone has been testing me, observing me, perhaps gauging my reaction." His eyes swept the group, once more resting briefly on Mrs. Hennessy, whose composed expression revealed a trace of tension. Miss Marple allowed a small smile to touch her lips. She had long understood that human nature rarely remained hidden when tested in subtle ways. The afternoon's events had created a web of minor disturbances, each eliciting responses that, when observed carefully, revealed motives, fears, and hidden knowledge. The time was nearing when those patterns would coalesce into something unmistakable. The garden, bathed in the golden hue of early evening, held its quiet tension like a living thing. Polite conversation had diminished, and every guest seemed caught between restraint and revelation. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly, savoring the calm before the unfolding clarity. Soon the next gesture, the next glance, would reveal truths that had remained concealed beneath civility. And when that moment came, she would see it, piece by piece, as clearly as one might trace the outline of a hidden path across a familiar landscape. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the distant treetops, leaving the Hartwell garden bathed in the soft amber of early evening. Shadows stretched and merged among the rose bushes and stone pathways, giving the once bright garden an almost contemplative quiet. Miss Marple remained seated beneath her canopy, her posture seemingly relaxed, yet every flicker of her eyes, every subtle movement of her head, conveyed an acute awareness of the small dramas unfolding around her. The day's disturbances, the missing umbrella, the hidden notebook, and the minor incidents near the fountain had begun to reveal a pattern, though the villagers themselves remained oblivious. Mr. Finch, notebook held tightly against his chest, walked slowly along the veranda, his eyes scanning the gathered guests with the careful scrutiny of a man who suspected something beyond mere mischief. "It seems," he said softly, almost to himself, "that someone has taken a deliberate interest in my belongings. and perhaps in my reactions. His gaze lingered briefly on Mrs. Hennessy, who, despite her outward composure, betrayed a subtle unease in the slight stiffening of her shoulders and the brief tightening of her gloved fingers. Across the lawn, Mr. George Ainsworth spoke quietly to Mrs. Hartwell, his words measured, polite, yet Miss Marple could see the undercurrent of controlled tension in his gestures and the way he occasionally cast glances toward both Mr. Finch and Mrs. Hennessy. The vigilance in his posture suggested he had a particular interest in observing the reactions of others, though whether that was from curiosity, concern, or complicity was yet unclear. Alice Brewer, moving among the guests with discreet care, continued her ministrations with a heightened alertness. Her eyes repeatedly shifted from Mrs. Hennessy to Mr. Finch and then to the surrounding guests. Miss Marple's sharp observation caught the brief flickers of recognition and caution in the young maid's demeanor, subtle hints that she was aware of incidents and motives that others either ignored or wished to conceal. The connections between servant and guest were delicate, yet revealing, and Miss Marple catalogued them silently, appreciating their significance in the unfolding web. A sudden sound broke the garden's uneasy calm. A teacup rattled on its saucer, perhaps nudged by a careless hand. The effect was immediate. Heads turned, hands froze mid-motion, and Mrs. Hennessy bent slightly to straighten a tray with almost exaggerated care. Her eyes, however, flicked briefly toward Mr. Hall Finch before returning to her task. Alice paused, her gaze lingering on the older woman with quiet scrutiny, before continuing her careful movements. Miss Marple recognized this interplay instantly. Minor disruptions often prompted the most revealing responses. Mr. Finch's voice, firm yet low, cut through the muted tension. I am certain now that these events are no accident. Someone among us has orchestrated them deliberately, testing reactions, perhaps to draw attention away from something else. His eyes scanned the group, landing briefly on Mrs. Hennessy once more. The older woman's composure remained outwardly intact, yet Miss Marple noted the subtle hesitation in her posture, a slight falter, barely perceptible, but significant. The afternoon's incidents were no longer isolated. They formed a network of deliberate provocations, each eliciting a reaction that exposed hidden layers of emotion, concern, and even guilt. Miss Marple, quietly observing, began to connect the behaviors, gestures, and fleeting expressions into a coherent pattern. The subtle orchestration of unease was deliberate, skillfully executed, and aimed at revealing truths beneath the veneer of politeness. As the final rays of sunlight warmed the garden stones, the music from the piano, a gentle, almost imperceptible melody, seemed to underscore the tension in the air rather than dispel it. The guests, caught in the delicate interplay of observation and self-control, were beginning to betray themselves, despite every effort to maintain decorum. Miss Marple, serene and unassuming, recognized that the moment for a subtle test, a small provocation, would soon arrive. It would be enough to reveal the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. She folded her hands lightly over her parasol, sipping her tea with deliberate calm. The threads were nearly in place. Every glance, every gesture, every minor disturbance, the seemingly trivial incidents of the day, had been woven together, and the tapestry of motive and deception was becoming unmistakably clear. And when the next moment arrived, as it inevitably would, the concealed truth would finally come to light, laid bare by observation and patience rather than force. The garden had settled into a deepening quiet, the soft amber of twilight mingling with the long shadows stretching across the lawn. The earlier disturbances, the missing umbrella, the hidden notebook, and the minor disturbances near the fountain, had left an invisible tension, threading itself through every gesture, every glance. Miss Marple, seated beneath her striped canopy, observed with the unhurried patience of someone accustomed to watching human nature unfold in its most revealing moments. Mr. Finch, still clutching his notebook, stood near the veranda, eyes scanning the gathering with a careful attentiveness. Though the umbrella rested at his side, his composure was far from restored. "It seems," he said softly, his voice carrying faintly in the evening air. "That someone has taken more than a casual interest in my possessions today. I suspect these incidents are deliberate. Tests, perhaps, or provocations." His gaze briefly met Mrs. Hennessy's, and though her expression remained polite and controlled, Miss Marple noticed the slight tension in her shoulders and the brief hesitation before she returned her attention to a nearby rose bush. Mr. George Ainsworth lingered at the edge of the veranda, speaking quietly to Mrs. Hartwell. His tone was calm, his words measured, but Miss Marple could detect the subtle undercurrent of vigilance in his posture. His eyes flicked repeatedly toward Mr. Finch and Mrs. Hennessy, suggesting an interest that went beyond mere observation. Was it curiosity or was it concern? Perhaps even complicity. The faint stiffness of his jaw and the controlled gestures of his hands hinted at a tension he sought to conceal. Alice Brewer, moving with quiet diligence among the guests, adjusted chairs and straightened trays. Yet her eyes were seldom on the objects she tended. Instead, they flicked repeatedly to Mrs. Hennessy and Mr. Finch, following interactions with a careful intensity. Miss Marple's mind noted the young maid's alertness. It suggested knowledge, or at least suspicion, beyond her station. In Linwood St. James, servants often saw what others preferred to ignore, and Alice's subtle attentiveness was a thread worth following. A new disruption came in the form of a faintly disturbed patch of earth near the fountain. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. The slight indentation, almost imperceptible, suggested that something had been hidden or retrieved recently. Mrs. Hennessy moved past it with a polite sweep of her gloved hand, as if to draw attention away, but her eyes flicked ever so briefly toward Mr. Finch. Alice paused in her movements, and Miss Marple noted the subtle recognition in her glance. A silent acknowledgement that the disturbance held significance. Mr. Finch spoke again, his voice firmer now, carrying an edge of determination. "I am convinced that today's events are no accident. Someone among us has been orchestrating these incidents deliberately, testing reactions, perhaps to uncover something hidden." His gaze swept the assembled guests, landing briefly on Mrs. Hennessy before moving elsewhere. She remained outwardly calm, yet Miss Marple detected the almost imperceptible quickening of her pulse, the faint flare of color across her cheeks. The tension in the garden had begun to crystallize. Subtle gestures, the twitch of a lip, the slight shifting of weight, the brief exchange of glances, were forming a coherent pattern. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, aligning each incident with the behaviors they provoked. The missing umbrella, the hidden notebook, the minor disturbances, all had been carefully designed to elicit reactions that might reveal secrets, test honesty, and expose unspoken knowledge. As twilight deepened, the garden seemed to hold its breath. Polite conversation had dwindled to nearly nothing, leaving a charged silence that magnified every small movement. Miss Marple, serene and unassuming, recognized the critical moment was approaching. A single gesture, a fleeting glance, or a subtle comment would soon unravel the delicate web of deception that had been woven throughout the day. She sipped her tea with deliberate calm, knowing that the culmination of the afternoon's events, the revelation of truth, was imminent, and that when it arrived, nothing would remain concealed. The last rays of the setting sun cast a warm glow over the Hartwell garden, the roses' colors muted in the soft amber light. The guests, though outwardly calm, carried a subtle tension in their movements, a residue of the day's peculiar events. Miss Marple, seated beneath her striped canopy, had watched it all unfold, every glance, every twitch, every hesitation recorded carefully in her mind. Now, the moment for clarity had arrived. She rose quietly, folding her parasol and stepping into the open space near the fountain, her presence gentle yet commanding. "I believe," she said softly, "that the day has provided us with more than garden entertainment. It has offered a series of small incidents, seemingly trivial, yet carefully orchestrated, that reveal more than most might suspect." Her gaze swept over the assembled guests, lingering for a fraction longer on Mrs. Hennessy and Alice Brewer. The older woman's composure was near perfect, though Miss Marple had observed the micro-expressions, the fleeting tightness of the lips, the slight hesitation in her step, the momentary flicker of recognition in her eyes. And then there was Alice, whose attentiveness, her quiet observance of gestures and exchanges, had betrayed her awareness of more than mere household duties. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, assembling each thread into a clear pattern. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "the missing umbrella and the hidden notebook were not acts of mere mischief. They were deliberate tests, small provocations meant to gauge reactions. And in observing these reactions, I have been able to see the truth behind the carefully maintained appearances." She paused, allowing the words to settle, then pointed gently toward Mrs. Hennessy. "There is no question of accidental involvement here. The disturbances near the fountain, the fleeting gestures of recognition between yourself and the young maid, Alice Brewer, all indicate that you, Mrs. Hennessy, were aware of the contents of Mr. Finch's notebook and sought to retrieve it without drawing attention. Your carefully practiced politeness nearly concealed the truth, but subtle signs of tension revealed the orchestration, Mrs. Hennessy's expression changed imperceptibly, a faint paling of the cheeks, a slight narrowing of the eyes, but she did not speak. The admission was already written in the micro-expressions Miss Marple had observed so patiently throughout the afternoon. Miss Marple turned to Mr. Finch. "Your notebook, it seems, contained observations that might have embarrassed more than one person if disclosed." Mrs. Hennessy, wishing to maintain a favorable social position, took advantage of small diversions, your missing umbrella, the disturbed soil, to act without overt notice. But as we have seen today, no one can entirely hide their actions in Linwood St. James. A pause fell over the group. Miss Hennessy drew in a quiet breath and, with a subtle sigh, acknowledged the truth. "Yes," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I had hoped to avoid scandal. But you are right, Miss Marple. I acted out of fear that certain details might come to light and disrupt what I have worked to maintain." Alice Brewer, who had remained poised but observant, gave a faint nod, confirming the older woman's account. It was clear that her own cautious awareness had only complicated the web of secrecy, though her intentions were innocent, motivated by duty rather than deception. Miss Marple, with her gentle smile, concluded, "The garden has provided its lessons today. Small actions reveal more than grand gestures. And though appearances may suggest calm, human nature seldom allows complete concealment." She folded her parasol, her eyes sweeping across the group one last time. "It is the patient observation of these subtleties, the glances, the gestures, the hesitation, that brings truth to light." The guests, now fully understanding the quiet detective work that had revealed the orchestrated disturbances, settled into an uneasy, reflective silence. Mr. Finch recovered his notebook, and Mrs. Hennessy, though composed once more, carried the quiet weight of acknowledgement. The garden returned to its serene appearance, the roses swaying gently in the evening breeze. But beneath the calm lay the unspoken understanding that appearances were never as they seemed. Miss Marple, seated again beneath her canopy, sipped her tea with deliberate calm. Human nature, she reflected, was rarely simple. Pride, fear, and the desire to maintain appearances could guide even the most careful actions. But patience, observation, and understanding could unravel the most delicate of webs. The day's subtle revelations had affirmed this truth, and as the twilight deepened, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The mysteries of Linwood St. James, she mused, were never truly lost. They merely waited for someone willing to see what others overlooked.